Good evening. My name is Kyle Zellner. I'm an associate professor of history and the director of the Dale Center here at Southern Miss. I want to thank everyone for coming out this evening for the 6th biennial General Buford Blount Professorship in Military History lecture. At this point, I would remind everybody to turn off your cell phones or at least to silent them. I almost wrote pagers when I wrote that down, and I thought that really dated me. Yeah. So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, Dr. Chris Winstead, who will speak about the Blount Professorship and introduce our speaker, Dr. Winstead.
Well, thank you, Kyle. It is my pleasure to be here tonight to talk a little bit about the Blount Professorship and also introduce our speaker. And so I'll just start off by noting that General Blount is right here with us, right down here down front. And so thank you for being here and for getting this lecture started. And so the General Buford Blount Professorship in Military History was established in 2013 with a generous donation by and in honor of General Buford Blount. A number of donors came together to make this happen, but General Blount and his wife Anita, who is also down front here, led the formation of this professorship, and we thank you for that. The professorship provides research support for a USM historian over a 2-year period as they work on a major publication in the field of military history, like you will see tonight in the talk that's coming up here. And so General Blount graduated from the University of Southern Mississippi in 1971 and was commissioned an Army officer from our own Southern Miss Army ROTC unit here on campus. And arguably one of our top ROTC graduates ever, right? Not, maybe the top, you think? And probably so. And anyway, he went on to have a distinguished career in the U.S. Army before retiring in 2005. During his service, he held many important commands. General Blount is best known for his command of the 3rd Infantry Division during the Iraq War, where he led the division's attack into Iraq and the capture of its capital, Baghdad. In 2023, the history of General Blount's leadership and the 3rd Infantry Division's exploits was published in the book 21 Days to Baghdad, General Buford Blount and the 3rd Infantry Division in the Iraq War. The book was published by our own Dale Center senior fellow and former Blount professor, Dr. Heather Sturr. So if you really want to know a lot more about General Blount, a great thing to do would be to buy Dr. Sturr's book, and you can learn all about that. Sorry, I had to put a plug in there for you.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
There you go. But anyway, we want to thank tonight General Blount, Anita, and all the other donors that came together to make this endowed professorship possible. You know, an endowed professorship like this provides financial resources, provides time for a faculty member to focus on a really big, important project. And so while it's always true that being an endowed professorship, holding a professorship like that, which I won't ever have, is prestigious, it's also very impactful. It really allows the work to take place, this really in-depth scholarship that is made possible by a professorship like this. And so it's a very real impact on the scholarship here at the institution and by association on our students. And so I don't want to lose sight of the fact of what a big influence those funds and this professorship actually are. So thank you for that. And turning to our speaker tonight, in 2023, Dr. Andrew Wiest, right down front here, join us shortly, a university distinguished professor of history and the founding director of the Dale Center, was named the 6th Blount Professor. Dr. Wiest received his PhD in history from the University of Illinois in Chicago in 1990. He has taught at USM since 1988. I can't help note that's the year I graduated. Sorry, Andy, couldn't help it. my bachelor's. My bachelor's degree was in, anyway, sorry. That's beside the point. Let me get back on track here. But Dr. Wiest is a specialist in the histories of World War I, the Vietnam War, modern military history, and lately, as you'll hear about, the history of the modern National Guard. His real specialty is the history of the true life of experiences of our soldiers, veterans, and their families. And I think Andy does that better than anyone. And so we're looking forward to hearing about that tonight. In addition to teaching at USM, Andy has taught at the War Studies Department of the British Royal Military Academy in Sandhurst, England, and as a visiting professor in the Department of Warfighting Strategy at the United States Air Force's Air War College. He is a founding director of two prestigious centers at Southern Miss, the Dale Center for the Study of War and Society that I mentioned earlier, and the Center for the Study of the National Guard that was much more recently founded. And so two centers with Dr. Wiest here at Southern Miss. And so obviously very impressive background here. From 2023 to 2025, Dr. Wiest has used the funds from the Blount Professorship to conduct historical research and undertake oral histories about the history of the modern National Guard. He's also utilized the professorship's funds to support the publication of his new book, Dogwood, a National Guard Unit's War in Iraq. So his talk tonight will focus on the book's central themes. Dr. Wiest, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, it's always helpful to know that your boss is younger than you. All righty, it's been my signal honor, as has been pointed out, to serve as the Blount professor over the past couple of years, and that professorship has been instrumental in both the research for this book and very deeply in the writing of this book. So I would like to thank General Blount and Anita once again for making all this possible. And as the dean kindly pointed out, my research of late has largely been focused on the confluence between wars and the young soldiers who go fight them. I spent a lot of time writing about the Vietnam War in that regard, but much more recently decided to switch over to write about my friends and neighbors, and specifically the National Guard's deployment to Iraq in 2005. I knew, because I knew a lot of these guys, I knew the stories were going to be compelling, but the more I looked into the story itself and began to research and write, I began to understand that the story they had was much bigger in a historical sense of importance and could be, and we hope to be, have it be transformative both to Southern Miss and maybe even to the National Guard itself. So along all those lines, I think what I probably first need to do is get back to that matter of historical importance. And I think to understand the historical importance of this story, you have to understand a little bit of the history of the National Guard. I mean, our country was born out of a fear of a standing army. In this case, one wearing red coats, and they notoriously don't talk to you when you're in front of Buckingham Palace. We had to get rid of those guys, and to get rid of those guys, of course, we had to rely on our citizen soldier militia to do that, and it'd be helpful if I turned it on. Born of the British tradition, the British had long had, dating back to the Anglo-Saxons, you can call it what you want to, a ferd or whatever, that they relied on a militia themselves. And of course, as English colonies, that militia took root over here. Arguably the first formalized militia that was set up in this country, although Florida likes to wag their finger at them, let's call it Massachusetts. And in 1631, it kind of becomes really set up. It is declared that every man, therefore, that wishes to secure his own freedom and thinks his duty to defend his country should, as he prides himself in being a free citizen, that his truest honor is to be a soldier citizen. And what Massachusetts did was they set up companies, usually about 64 men, based on towns, and it was a draft from all men ages 16 and up, and their duty was to military exercise, serve in training, watching, warding under the penalty of 5 shillings for every fault. Kyle probably knows that sounds like a lot of money for the time, 5 shillings if you skipped out on your training. Of course, as you might suspect, getting the young men of a town together with guns was kind of fun, and these turned into social events, and the National Guard's local social impact is still a big part of what the Guard is today. To this day, Guard armories are often the centerpiece of small communities across the country. Of course, there's always some risk in that. Some of the earliest militia records in Massachusetts are complaints about how these young men comported themselves. They, quote, vainly spend their time in powder, 5 shillings if you skipped out on your training. Of course, as you might suspect, getting the young men of a town together with guns was kind of fun, and these turned into social events, and the National Guard's local social impact is still a big part of what the Guard is today. To this day, Guard armories are often the centerpiece of small communities across the country. Of course, there's always some risk in that. Some of the earliest militia records in Massachusetts are complaints about how these young men comported themselves. They, quote, vainly spend their time in powder by inordinate shooting in the day and night, followed by shameful and scandalous sin of excessive drinking, tippling, and keeping company in taverns. Tippling sounds particularly fun to me. But of course, when push came to shove, it was this militia, including the tipplers, at fun places like Lexington, that stood initially against what the British regular forces had to throw at them. And to me, what is there in the shot heard around the world at Lexington is pretty demonstrative of what the Guard was. The oldest guy, the commander of the Lexington militia, was 47. He had 70 men in his company. Among them were 8 pairs of fathers and sons, many extended family members, and the oldest was 67, the youngest was 16. And just as an example, the company of soldiers I study, the oldest man was 48, the youngest was 18. There were 20 cousins and 5 sets of brothers. So the National Guard in some ways hadn't changed all that much. It's still a local institution, especially in small towns like Loosedale, that has kept up Bravo Company for as long as there's been a Loosedale. You can't go around Loosedale without running into National Guardsmen. And if you go to the little outlying communities, my favorite one is named Buzzard Roost. Pretty much everybody in Buzzard Roost has a Guard background, one way, shape, or form, because it's one of the very few ways to get out of that town economically. And as you might suspect, as the wars that I write about continue, the stress on these communities has been greater and greater. So to get back to my earlier incarnation of a historian, the British had these things in World War I called PALS battalions that were raised from single towns that had great benefits and also great drawbacks, especially when there's a cost to be paid. National Guard units in many ways are like forever PALS battalions, ones, of course, that never go away. After the Revolution and the victory of the American citizen soldier, the militia became a sacred concept in the United States, with people like Thomas Jefferson saying that the founding of a strong regular military had too many perceived risks of what a national government could do with that military. So we went back to the militia. In fact, in the wake of the American Revolution, the Continental Army that had won that revolution, of course with the militia's aid, was deconstructed. It was gone, setting the tenor for American wars. We raise armies, train them, fight with them, and then get rid of them and go back to a militia system. It's particularly interesting in the wake of the Revolutionary War that the regular army got down to a total of 80 people when the country was first getting started. So at the very beginning, the militia is who we are. It's written in to law with the Militia Act of 1792, which maintains the militia, which will eventually become called the National Guard, with lots of fits and starts in between historically. It's the chief source of martial manpower for this country. And the stories we're going to see is of the militia usually being called up in time of war, often butting its head against some pretty bad circumstances because they haven't often been training for the wars they're actually going to face. Then we raise the army, then we destroy it. Just as I didn't get the best picture there. He's all blurry, so we've all been tippling before we look at this picture. The next big war, War of 1812, there's way more to it than this, but who comes out as the big hero? Andrew Jackson, a militia/volunteer leader. Similar, this will speak to the heart of Mississippians. It's 1847. It's the war against Mexico. 90% of the soldiers who were at the pivotal Battle of Buena Vista were militia volunteers, led by a little tiny group called the Mississippi Rifles and their commander Jefferson Davis, who at the critical moment of that battle, of course, told his soldiers, "Stand fast, Mississippians." So we get the militia making its name in all these wars. Civil War, maybe a bit of a different question. If you go, we're teaching the very first class ever on the history of the National Guard in this whole country, like right now. And our lectures last week were on the Civil War. And it was pointed out that if you look at the beginning of this war, it's militias. And what do those militias expect to do? Destroy the other force quickly, go take the enemy capital, Washington or Richmond, take your pick. And what we get is the Battle of Bull Run. That is just, it looks like militias fighting, who they make mistakes, they mistake units for other units, they run away. There's all kinds of stuff going on in that battle. But what this proves to the Americans during this confrontation is that they're going to need a regular army to fight out the end of the Civil War. So once again, we have the militia at the beginning, but this time the militia is going to come out the other end changed. We're going to institute a national draft. In the wake of the war, there's this, has to do a lot with Reconstruction. In the South, there's the act called Posse Comitatus in 1878 that precludes the standing military from any police function on the home front. That goes to the National Guard. So we began to, in the wake of the Civil War, have this new professionalization of these militias, in part brought on by what had happened in the Civil War and their shortcomings when they faced battle. And also this kind of dual role the National Guard will now play. It is going to do the home front stuff, from rescuing you from storms to political confrontations, you name it. The Army's not going to have a role in that. But the National Guard is also going to be very much modernized in the way that it's going to train and fight. And this is really emphasized in the Spanish-American War. And if you understand the way that one rolls out, again, a big hero, in this case, Teddy Roosevelt. He's leading volunteers. He's leading militiamen up San Juan Hill. But if you follow that war deeply on the inside, it is riven with huge mistakes being made by the American forces, usually at the supply level. We lose way more soldiers to things like spoiled meat than we do to Spanish shooting them. So it becomes pretty obvious that what we need to do is really nationalize the National Guard. What we'd had to this point was state militias doing what states told them to do. Some militias were great and some weren't, and you cobbled them together in time of war at your own risk. But in the wake of the Spanish-American War, we get the Militia Act of 1903, which is called the Dick Act. And what it does is creates the modern National Guard, where its training will be uniform, its arming will be uniform, its supply will be uniform across the board. And just in time, because we're going to need them, World War I is in the offing. And once again, it is the National Guard that is first to go. And National Guard serves a whole lot in World War I. 40% of the soldiers that we send abroad to World War I are National Guardsmen. Their federalization process has some interesting kinks in it. but they're National Guardsmen. Guard units suffer a total of 103,000 casualties in World War I. So again, even as we get more modern, the Guard is always there. Now the Guard, having been created out of the old militia. World War II, same thing again. The first 5 divisions we send overseas in World War II, National Guard divisions. The first 3 divisions to see combat are National Guard divisions. And these are at fun places. If you know where combat first takes place, the one on the left is Guadalcanal. You don't want to be there. The Marines are the first ashore, but they're reinforced by National Guardsmen. And the one on the right is Kasserine Pass in North Africa, where we bump into a rather famous little military commander, Erwin Rommel, and his Africa Corps. So we toss the National Guard into some of the biggest haymakers that World War II has to offer. The National Guard in World War II sends abroad it makes up, where's those numbers? I hate numbers. 20% of the U.S. total losses in World War II are National Guard losses, meaning that 175,000 National Guardsmen are killed or wounded in World War II. Stuff you usually don't read about and hear about, which is going to be one of the things we deal with later. Things changed after World War II. Some of you have lived through some of these changes, but infamously or famously, the National Guard is not really called up in either Korea or Vietnam for a whole host of different reasons. But what I want to shift to now is the post-Vietnam War stuff, because that is, in many ways, the most important heart of where all this book gets started. There's a huge reaction to the Vietnam War. We may argue about whether we lost it or won it or whatever, but the Army does not argue about that. The Army's got to figure out a better way to fight than it did in Vietnam. Historians love to debate about this kind of stuff. What we debate about is the end of the draft. What we debate about is the doctrinal shift to maneuver war as opposed to attritional war. What we debate about is reliance on revolutionary new weapon systems. Historians talk about that stuff perhaps boringly all the time. But what they've really missed, I would argue, is a fundamental restructuring of what the National Guard has always been. And here's the basic part of that story. The guy in the middle here is General Crichton Abrams. General Westmoreland was our first commander in Vietnam, and he was followed in command by Abrams, who many think was a better commander than Westmoreland. That is 100% up to you historically, which one you think. But Abrams came to the singular conclusion that the reason we lost the Vietnam War is because we didn't call up the National Guard. He felt the National Guard was the link between the passion of the people and the military. If you don't call them up, you're fracturing the relationship between the American population and its military. So what he decided to come up with was something called the total force policy, which has a lot of other things to it as well. But in general, what he tries to do is create a situation where the next time we go to war, you cannot go to war without the National Guard. Part of that is putting some of the military's logistic capability into the National Guard, but maybe the biggest part of it was what they called at that point in time the round-out concept, where a division would have 3 brigades within it. Speaking in military terminology, if you don't know this stuff, just kind of pretend like you do. A division will have about 3 brigades. The round-out system meant 2 of those brigades came from the regular Army and 1 came from the National Guard. So if a division went to battle at full strength, it had to take its round-out brigade with it. This policy has been updated. This policy has been changed. But the kernel remains the same. We ain't going to war without the National Guard. That is wholly oversimplified, but there you go. What this means for the Guard, it has to be equipped to a new level. It has to be trained to a new level. It has to be at the sharp edge of war. It's got to be ready to deploy now, not months from now. It's got to be ready to go. So it's a different level of what the National Guard has been dealing with since its inception. This for the Guard initially was difficult. A bunch of folks left the Guard. This is a more kinetic force. Kinetic means it's going to go fight. Some Guardsmen hadn't signed up for that, so they left. But since the Guard has these connections to local communities, it quickly found a way to get around its recruitment problems, especially after 9/11 came and went. So the Guard kept up to speed, but it was a new Guard. What did this mean on the local level? It means Guard connection to the community is going to be severed somewhat. Less training in Loosedale, more training at Camp Shelby kind of thing locally. There's still a local connection for the Guard, but that becomes a little more tenuous. All of this is going to be tested in General Blount's drive to Iraq in 2003. There were some National Guard units there, but it wasn't a major National Guard deployment yet. But things don't end in 2003. The war degenerates into something else. And what this means is all over the country, the phones are going to start ringing. And this is when we get right to the heat of this book. The National Guard is going to have to be called up to fight against the insurgency in Iraq. For Mississippi, what this meant was the call up of the 155 Brigade combat team. The thing was going to be headed to Iraq. About 3,000 guys in that. Far too many for me to write a book about that you actually want to read. Otherwise, it'd be that damn thick. So my focus, I had to narrow that down to a smaller group of people. So I chose the guys I knew best. The 150th Combat Engineers that are part of the 155. In Iraq, that is normally about 200-ish people. Maybe that's still a big number. Of those 200-ish, I've interviewed about 100 to try to get to the depth of that story. Still, the biggest complaint about this book is by people who are going to read it. They're going to go, there's too many people in there. I can't remember all of them. And so it's already too big, even when we shrunk it down to about 200 guys. So they're called up. They go to training first at Camp Shelby and then to the National Training Center. Combat engineers, they're generally expecting to build stuff to defend you or knock enemy stuff down to undefend them, to do combat engineer stuff. And to be broken down, there's one combat engineer battalion. It's going to be broken down into its component parts to serve with the elements of the 155 that they're associated with. That's the job they tend to be training for. And they're doing it so well when they go to the National Training Center for one of the coldest turns at the National Training Center. They even impressed the local opposition forces, which is pretty rare. So, beginning of 2005, when they get on the ground, essentially the Mississippi Guard, the 155, is going to be located here. There's Baghdad. I'm kind of leaning in a funny direction. Here's Anbar Province, which is a pretty bad place to be. And the Mississippians are going to own Camp Hitt. We'll deal with that later. The Mississippians are going to largely own those forward operating bases, with the idea that big chunks of the 155 will land there and smaller chunks of the 150th will land there with them to do the combat engineer duties. Once in Kuwait, the Mississippians, well, they start off in Kuwait, which is just in the south of this map. The Mississippians meet up with their equipment. They're at a large holding facility in Kuwait where they notice they don't have the same equipment that the Army does. The Army has a lot more what are called up-armored vehicles. The Mississippians and the 150th especially don't tend to have them. In fact, it had just been a couple months before that a Tennessee National Guardsman had noticed that and had Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense at the time, was touring the base, and he complained about that to Rumsfeld, actually on television. And Rumsfeld's response was, you go to war with the army you have, not the army you wish you have, which means these guys are going to go in across the berm into Iraq with vehicles not specially designed to survive what they're going to face. Again, for the 150th, if they're going to do their job they expect to do, A lot of that's going to be on the forward operating bases. Maybe it's not quite as frightening, but as the advanced parties get out to where they're supposed to be at those forward operating bases, a different set of orders comes in. The Marines are having big trouble in Anbar Province. They need the Mississippians to take over a little more of Anbar Province, and the only spare Mississippians are the 150th, and they're going to be put together as opposed to going out to serve the combat engineer duties. They're going to be put here at something called Forward Operating Base Dogwood, about 15 miles from Baghdad, as an infantry battalion. They're going to own the place. They're going to have to do the same thing that other infantry battalions are going to have to do. So, going to a place they didn't expect. In fact, they expected so little that the convoy going there gets lost. They don't have the correct equipment. They have good equipment, but not the correct equipment to survive what they're going to face. And it's also in a fun area of Iraq called the Triangle of Death. Doesn't sound like a great place to go to. There are three things going on here that are going to really complicate what's going on. When Baghdad fell or was in the process of falling, a lot of ammunition was squirreled away in the desert. Guess where it was squirreled away to? Right outside Fob Dogwood, where the 150th is going to wind up. Turns out it's the armory of the rebels in Iraq. Second thing, you see a little town north of there. It's about 10 miles north of Fob Dogwood, a little town called Fallujah. The Marines had just fought a big battle there and had run out a lot of the insurgents, and the insurgents had gone to ground where? In the little villages that are going to be owned by the 150th. The 150th AO is bigger than the city of New York. It has about 70,000 people living in it in little small villages. You don't know whether they're good guys or bad guys, but about 70,000 of them. And the Mississippians have about 100 guys they can send outside the wire per day. So it's a tough situation that these guys are thrown into. When they get there, Fob Dogwood is basically a ramshackle piece of junk in the middle of nowhere. It has a couple of hardened buildings that have been looted of all their stuff worth having. It's being held by a cavalry unit that when the Mississippians show up and go on ride-alongs with them, cavalry unit says, "Where are your tanks?" The Mississippians say, "We don't have any tanks." And the cavalry soldiers tell them, "Well, good damn luck. I'm glad I'm not going to be here with you." Because these guys had already suffered losses. The British, a Black Watch unit, had held it before them, and they suffer 8 losses. They know how tough this place is going to be when the Mississippians show up. It was the second day that they were in combat. Actually, not in combat. They're just there trying to figure the place out, right? Sean Cooley was a nurse at Singing River Hospital. I have to read the book, but there's a couple of reasons he didn't have to go to Iraq. But he was damn well going to Iraq because he knew his buddies were going to need him. Favorite soldier of every soldier in the unit. On the day in question, he'd already been on one patrol that morning. He did not have to go on that second patrol. But he knew a guy in the Humvee needed him there. And so he was there. And so not only did he get on that patrol, he got in the Humvee and drove it. That Humvee hits a IED, and Sean is killed. Just a couple quick quotes. There's far too many quotes in this book for me to hit you with too many. But this is from the Journal of Hap Palmer, who was there. Said 2 medics, Specialist Joe Smith and Sergeant Winston Walker, were working on Sean. A medevac had been called, and the bird was coming as the medics picked up the litter and moved it to the other side of the 113 to shield it from the gathering crowd. But everybody had already seen the black body bag. Captain Paul Lyon kicked the dirt when he saw that bag. I wanted to get close to Paul to help him, but I couldn't. In fact, I would not have known what to say. There was nothing to say. A few days later, the unit had a ceremony remembering Cooley, and this is a quote from Palmer's journal again. He said, "At the conclusion, the roughly 200 people in attendance filed by the tribute stand and paid their respects by saluting this fallen soldier. Just prior to that, First Sergeant Mergenschroer told the group to stand ready for roll call. 'Sergeant Arnold, here, First Sergeant,' was the reply. 'Sergeant Brewer, here, First Sergeant.' Again, we heard Staff Sergeant Collins, here, First Sergeant. Sergeant First Class Cooley, no reply. Sergeant First Class Sean Cooley, again, no reply. Sergeant First Class Sean Michael Cooley. After a long pause, the reply came, 'This soldier is not in this formation.' I got chills, attention was called, taps was played. Some cried, and the rest acted like they didn't want to cry. They'd never seen anything like this before. This is going to be super embarrassing, but Sean's wife is with us tonight. This is Sean's wife, Laura. The 150th under Lieutenant Colonel Roy Robinson faced a tactical problem. He needed tanks, and he traded a platoon of his combat engineers to get those tanks. He also knew he needed some other help. These guys had grown up together, served together, played football against each other. They'd been together their whole lives and needed some help. He called in a combat psychiatrist. That's Dr. Rosalind Morris, known as Psycho 6. The men didn't want to talk to her. She was all kinds of wrong. She was a brain doctor. She was an officer, and she didn't want them to smoke. All kinds of fun things. Her solution was to get to know the guys. She went out on missions with them. And on 2 missions, one I know of very specifically, she got hit by IEDs. Almost certainly the first woman officer to earn a combat action badge in Iraq. Not supposed to be there. She got in all kinds of trouble from her superiors for being there. Everybody knew what the damn problem was. It was this town, Owasat. It was chock full of bad guys. There are bad guys everywhere. It's where those guys from Fallujah had gone. And Dogwood is right here. They knew the bad guys were there, but they had to drive across open desert to go get those bad guys. And every time they got there, those guys had hopped in little boats and gone across the Euphrates River into another AO, and they couldn't chase them. Also, although there were helicopters with these missions, the choppers were never able to open fire on these guys because there may be non-combatants in there with them. So what happened in the first couple of months was just a very uncomfortable rhythm that developed. Patrol after patrol, keeping the bad guys far away from Dogwood, but IED blown, almost killing Norris Galatas, an IED taking off Sergeant Wong's legs, you name it. There's not another death, but there's just lots of injuries, and there's nothing to be shown for it, because every time you show up to where the bad guys are at, they're gone. Every time. In June, things change. In June, there's an M113 that hits another IED. The M113 had some what they call hillbilly armor on the bottom of it. They'd welded armor into the bottom, but instead of shrapnel going through the vehicle, the armor came up, and the 3 men in the back of the 113 were killed. On the right here, we have Larry Arnold, the oldest guy in the unit. He didn't have to go back to Iraq. He'd been there when General Blount went into Baghdad. He was there, but he had fallen ill and had to be shipped back home. So he wanted to get the job finished, and he also knew he was going to be serving with his son. So he went to Iraq. His son was in his place he was in his son's place in the 113 that day. Soldier up here on the right, Terrence Lee, worked at Ingalls on the coast, fell in love and married Stephanie. They had a child on the way, and he knew the best way to help that child's life was to join the Guard, and he did that. He was in the back of that 113. And here on the left is an Iraqi interpreter named Asim, but everybody called him Ron. He was only 17 years old, desperately wanted to be an American. His goal was to be going to an American college before it was all said and done. His parents refused to come pick up his body because they said that, as far as they were concerned, he was dead the day he joined the Americans. So as far as we would have no idea where he's buried. After this, Robinson loses it. He says that he's going to end the problem in Owasat. His quote that he uses, the next raid on Owasat, there's not going to be any goddamn doors left on goddamn hinges, okay? But there's still a problem. They can still see you coming. In June, after an awful lot of belly aching and complaining about it, he gets one more line company to come in, Charlie Company. To this point, the line companies for the 150th that have been Alpha and Bravo, they get back their Charlie Company, which means they now have enough troops to take the war to the enemy. And eventually what they do here is Owasad has a road that runs along the river. They cut that. As you can see down here, they make a checkpoint down here to choke any traffic from the south. And they're going to make a checkpoint up here that's just right in the outskirts of the village to choke off all traffic. And they concrete in a lot of these roads, paying local people to do the work. By the way, of course, the bad guys were paying the locals to put the IEDs in. If we pay them more, they're less likely to be putting in IEDs. But still there's the problem. Still there's the problem of getting over there before the bad guys get away. But this pressure on the village had been so much that one of the locals defects to the 150th. The guy is called the Screaming Chicken, and he has the goods on everybody. And in July, there's this huge raid run by everybody on Owasat, and this time the helicopters are given the order to fire. The boats start crossing the river, and the helicopters make it pretty apparent you're not going to get across the river. And 150 insurgents are captured that night, 4 of whom were on that deck of cards that they handed out. If you remember, there was a deck of cards of the leading bad guys. 4 of them were some of the top wanted bad guys in all of Iraq. 4 more missions like this are run. Next one gets about 34 bad guys, and next one gets about 20, and it just starts going down from there. Of course, in the middle of all this, Katrina comes and says hello to the 150th AO back home. And to make matters worse, I could talk a lot about Stephanie Lee. This is Terrence Lee's wife. She gives birth to the couple's child during Katrina in Loosedale. In fact, she's told to evacuate. She evacuates to Shreveport, but she's just getting a generator to bring that back because she wants their child to be born in the house she had gotten for Terrence to live in. Her story goes on a lot from there. But Katrina was a uniquely difficult time for the guys. If you ask the guys, they never told their wives about the bad stuff going on because they were worried that they would worry too much and hid it from them, didn't want the wives to be concerned about their futures. Well, now it's on the exact other foot. All contact with Mississippi is lost. They have no idea whether they have homes. Many of their homes have been destroyed. There are no fatalities in the group. But of course, everybody wants to get home and deal with the problems they have back home. So you throw all that in the middle of what this unit is doing as well. The whole time, these raids are still going on. And beginning in September, something amazing happens. Outside of Fob Dogwood at that little place called Dog Patch, these 3 guys show up. They are the sheiks of the Owasat tribe. There's an Owasat tribe that lives in that town. And they come up, and I forget, was it Mergenshore who said this? He said, "Y'all here to surrender?" And they said, well, yes, we are, in their language. And they come in and they tell Robinson, hey, the bad guys are gone. They've gone on to places where bad stuff isn't happening to them, places more safe for them. And now the only people left in the town are the civilians, and we're like starving because you've cut off all communications. into our town. And what we get is a situation where the 150th this has happened in other villages as well, but Owasat's the one example I'll be using tonight. What we get from here on out are weekly meetings between these guys and Robinson and the 150th. And one of the chief points of contention is who's going to bring the tea to the meetings. These guys hate sweet tea. And I was hoping Richard Rowland would be here tonight. If you're an American, you got to have a very advanced digestive system to not suffer the consequences of their tea. So you have, because it's made out of Euphrates River water, so it's not the best thing in the world. But what we get is a situation after this where it is largely at peace. It's one of the most significant victories the coalition wins while we're in Iraq. This chunk of the Triangle of Death is no longer the Triangle of Death. There's a couple more IEDs in the story because these guys aren't going to give up without a fight. There's a few Iraqis assassinated because these guys aren't going to give up without a fight. But generally, we're down to MedCap missions. And I get to tell a lot of fun stories about MedCap missions. One of my favorite ones is that they always loved getting, because they gave out toys and candy bars and you name it with their MedCap missions. But I think it was Paul who told me this story. The one they hated was the dentist, because he's going in there after some teeth. Almost certainly he's going in there after some teeth. And he said one guy showed up, an older Iraqi gentleman, and he had 2 teeth. That was the sum total of his teeth. And they weren't doing that good. And he told the dentist he could only pull one of them because his wife had said if he comes back home with no teeth, she's leaving him. So he went back home with 1 tooth, no matter how bad that tooth was. But what we get is a situation where the Mississippians, they adopt a school, they adopt an orphanage, they help a little child that has some pretty severe birth defects, get surgery. They did it. They did what they were supposed to do against all odds. When the year winds down, the Mississippians are getting ready to go home. Well, the Marines come in, and they're going to take over Dogwood. And now it's the Mississippians letting the Marines ride along with them, telling them about the area. And each Mississippian has like a book of information here. Here are the sheiks. Here's the town. Here's all this. The Marines didn't want none of that. The Marines were there to kick butt and take names. None of this pacification crap for them. In fact, they got rid of Dogwood. They didn't even want that no more. Dogwood, when these guys got there, was a scratch in the desert. At the end, man, it's got a MWR tent where everybody watches. It's a big point of contention, but Alabama barely beats Ole Miss that year, and that was evidently the biggest point of contention the whole time, was people rooting for one football team or the other. It's got a great dining facility. It's all air conditioned, you name it. All that stuff is destroyed. The Marines don't want it. So that when the Mississippians go home, the area that they had been in Iraq is abandoned. And they knew exactly what was going to happen, and you knew what was going to happen too. Al-Qaeda comes back to Owasat. Owasat actually raises, because it got kind of happy not being ruled over by bad guys, Owasat actually raises a self-defense force of 200 guys that Al-Qaeda is just going to wipe out. It's worth noting, by the way, that what the Mississippians had done was, of course, forgotten by the guys who immediately followed them. They just didn't care. The Army keeps no records on this. I was finding real difficulty finding records. And I got so excited when I found the Marines' official history of Anbar Province in 2005. That's bound to have Mississippi National Guardsmen all over it. There's not even a mention of the National Guard in it. That these guys disappeared from history and disappeared from the consciousness, which is going to cost us. Because the Owasat area, once again, becomes a hotbed for insurgency. And in 2009, it hits the news. Some insurgents from Owasat capture and kill 3 American soldiers. And the Army launches a big raid on Owasat called Operation Marine Courageous. And this one's filmed by everybody. There's a New York, Los Angeles Times reported there. There's reporters all over this one because this is a big, big operation. They smack the hell out of Owasat. And lo and behold, while they're there, 3 guys turn up. Said, we'd love to work with you guys. Yeah, that's General Roy Ordinero, one of the top brass over there. And if you read the stories about this battle in '09, all these stories gush, saying that these are the first Americans to set foot there. These are the first time those three sheiks had ever met an American. Of course, they'd met an American for months, just a couple years before, but it was a National Guard thing, and nobody cared about. It was a really fun part of my research that I was able to contact one of the local interpreters that served with the unit, and I asked him, just off chance, are there any of those guys in OSUT that I could talk to? He said no, because after Al-Qaeda, there's a even more fun group called ISIS that moves into that area. Those three guys were executed, and he doesn't think there's anybody there who'd even remembered the Mississippians, because everybody there who'd worked with the Mississippians had been killed. So I would argue that what the 150th went through is just a tiny little fraction, a micro history, if you will, of that big change in the National Guard that I narrated earlier, what it is now compared to what it was before. Into the importance of this for us, one of the reasons I had a hard time researching this damn thing is that the Navy, the Army, the Air Force, Marines too, all have an archive and study center dedicated to them. The Navy one has 6 million documents in it. I hadn't used that one, but I've used the other ones. They're amazing resource centers. So I just figured when I was going to research the National Guard, there'd be something like that. There's not. Guard materials, there's well-meaning Guard historians all over the country who we're going to be having here next week in a big meeting. But to write about the Guard, you have to go to 54, 55 different places. So what we've done here is we've created this thing, the Center for the Study of the National Guard, and our goal is to put all that stuff together into one place so other folks can write about the Guard and won't run into the problems that I did. And that's kind of where I'm planning on stopping and maybe taking any questions. Dr. Zellner. I didn't run too far over.
No. I would have stopped you if you'd run too far over. So we do have time for a few questions. If anybody has questions, I'm happy to.
And I had to cut out a lot, I promise you. So I beat him into submission. It's like a freshman class out there. There's a midterm coming up, so you better be ready.
Andrew Haley's not here, so there's no. Caleb.
Yeah, Professor. I know you talked about some of the ideas and stuff. Were those the only casualties within that you found that they had, or was there other casualties in some of that?
There were two other casualties that were not caused by IEDs, but most of them were caused by IEDs. One casualty was caused by a friendly fire incident, where a guy's convoy got fired on by another American convoy. And there was some sniper. What I didn't talk about is one of the platoons of the company is taken out of Dogwood and put into an even tougher place called Hit. And it does suffer some direct fire losses, but the vast majority of losses are IEDs. And of course the IEDs they're facing, Shelby did and National Training Center did a real good job of, the typical IEDs that you expect, a piece of junk on the side of the road with a bomb in it, and they did face those. But since these guys are in the desert and there's not hardball roads, you're able to dig into the desert, put a pressure plate in there, and then cover it up, and it's indistinguishable from the surrounding countryside. So these guys find an IED when they hit it. They're unable, it's really impossible to see them.
Other question. Katya?
Thank you so much for such an interesting lecture and a very moving one. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the reasons why you think the National Guard was able to tackle this area with less civilian casualties than the Marines.
This is right when the the U.S. Army is switching over from kind of what they were expecting, a more force-on-force kind of thing, to their, the historians like to maybe even point out that it was too much emphasis on something called counterinsurgency. But it's in the book that the U.S. command structure sends out guys to see how counterinsurgency is being done. And it says only about 10% of the units are getting it right at this point, because that's, again, they were expecting more of a force-on-force thing. They hadn't really been training deeply in counterinsurgency. The guy who wrote the counterinsurgent manual, it was written by a guy named David Petraeus, which you might have heard of, and a guy named John Noggle, which you might have not heard of, but John's an academic friend of mine, and I called him up and I said, look, well, what is the most adept part of the U.S. military at counterinsurgency? He didn't have to think for a second. He said National Guard. Because every person in there has a skill other than force-on-force, Army stuff. They're lawyers. God, there's a bunch of lawyers. Sorry about that. There's policemen, there's construction workers, there's vertical construction, there's horizontal. I mean, the guys are good at almost everything. There's farmers, and it's what you need some hometown ingenuity to be able to do coin, and these guys have it. So the National Guard is wonderful at counterinsurgency just by the nature of the beast to a certain degree.
Another question.
And if you ask the Guard too, they'll always say, hey, we're used to doing more with less. That's just what the National Guard does.
Are there any other Mississippi units mentioned in the book?
Yes. The Mississippi Guard loses 30. I actually counted at 31 dead while they're there, which includes 2 contractors. It includes people who are seconded from other National Guard. It also includes 211th Cavalry who's working with us. Every one of those losses is chronicled in the book. Even though I focus on that one unit, it was in Hat Palmer's journal again. I mean, every time the Guard family lost somebody, the entire communication network shut down. So you knew somebody had been killed, and even if they weren't in your specific battalion, you knew them. You'd work with them. Maybe you'd been in with them in another unit. So he said that he just dreaded it when that communication shutdown came, because he was wondering which one of his friends died, even though it wasn't somebody in his specific unit. So the Guard is a family, and I tried to, even though I was focused on that one part, do honor to the people across the Guard as a whole for that deployment.
Yeah, Andrew?
Some excellent talk, Dr. Wiest. One thing that kind of provoked curiosity for me was the difficulty between operating within the AOs of the respective units. Is there anything that you think that contributed to that aspect of the fighting?
Why the bad guys could run across into another AO and get away? In part because the Euphrates was not only AO, it was also, God, I forget the exact terminology, multi-force National West, which was Anbar, and then you cross a whole nother into another giant command structure across the Euphrates. Nobody was able to answer that question for me well enough. Why isn't there guys waiting on the other side of the river who are on your team to take care of them? And it must have just been a fly in the ointment, because it never, ever happened. And including when you get up to Operation Marine Courageous, when 2009, when those guys come from the other AO across the river, they actually have to expand their AO to take OSOT, and they have to take that area from Multinational Force West. So, yeah, there are these interesting borders and, I don't know, rivalries. I don't know. I'd like to think it was, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. Wish I did.
We have time for one more, probably. Yes, sir.
I think one of the main reasons we invaded or went into Iraq was because of the claim of weapons of mass destruction. And I wondered in all your research, did you ever uncover anything that might have exposed those weapons of mass destruction, like oil and gas and that type of thing?
That there is no doubt that they ran across poison gas. There's 100% no doubt about that. The tendency was, and I'll let them, because there's a lot of members of this unit in here, you didn't like open up the shell to see what was in it. You piled them up and blew all the damn things up in gigantic freaking explosions. And yes, there was certainly poison gas in some of those. No nuclear capabilities that I heard anything about that. But definitely there were gas weapons.
So I'd like to thank Dr. Wiest for an amazing talk on an important topic.
Thank you. And I'll be hanging around outside if you want to talk more.